Hello guys, so in this example we're going to go over a concept called the quotient rule, which is another method of differentiation, and it's pretty simple. It's just the formula is kind of confusing, inconvenient, so once you get used to calculus, try to avoid using quotient rule, but for this problem we have to use the quotient rule because we have a function of f of x divided by a function g of x. So without further ado, the first thing we're going to do in this function is notice the formula has the form of a quotient rule. So f of x divided by g of x. Anytime you see a function like this, go ahead and apply the quotient rule where you have a numerator over the denominator. And then we plug it into this formula, g of x times f prime of x minus g prime of x times f of x times all divided over gx squared. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify f of x and g of x. So in doing so, our f of x is simply just this numerator, which is equal to 55. And our g of x will simply just be the denominator. So our g of x is going to be 4x cubed plus 4. So now the next step would be to find f prime of x and g prime of x. And we do this by taking the derivative. So f prime of x will simply be 0 because the derivative of any constant is 0. And g prime of x, taking the derivative of this function of each term, we get 12x squared. And this derivative of this is just 0. So this right here is our g prime of x. So now that we have f of x, f prime of x, g of x, and g prime of x, the next step is to plug it all into the quotient rule. So the quotient rule up there says that g of x times f prime of x minus g prime of x times f of x all over gx squared is equal to the derivative of f of x over g of x. So now we literally just plug in the terms. So plug into quotient rule. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and plug in. So g of x was 4x cubed plus 4 times f prime of x, which is 0, minus g prime of x, which is 12x squared, times f of x. Our f of x is 55, divided by g of x squared. And our g of x squared is 4x cubed plus 4 squared. And if you want to simplify this, this zeroes out. So, and then 55 times 12 is equal to 550. 550 plus 110 is 660. So this would be, and we have a negative sign right here that we have to keep into account. So this would be negative 660 x squared over, in our denominator, you don't have to square it. It's not necessary. In fact, I would say it's even more proper to leave it as gx squared rather than just like foiling it out. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as gx squared. And that's how you apply the quotient rule. So step 1, recognize it's a quotient rule derivative when you have a function on a numerator divided by a function on the denominator. Next, identify your numerator as f of x and your denominator as g of x, as we did right here. Then the next step would be to differentiate both, take the derivative of both, which we did right here. Then the next step is literally just to plug it all into the quotient rule. So yeah, so identify your variables, identify it's a quotient rule problem, identify your variables f of x, g of x, f prime x, and g prime x, and then plug into quotient rule. And that's how you perform quotient rule differentiation. All right, hope that was helpful. Thank you guys for watching. Hello guys, so in this example, we've come across the quotient rule, and we're gonna learn how to use the quotient rule to take the derivative of a function. So when to use a quotient rule? Use the quotient rule whenever you have a function of a numerator divided by a function on the denominator. And when you can't use algebra to just simplify it. Like right here, it would be easier to just use a quotient rule because you have a function on the numerator and a function on the denominator. So the first step is to just be able to simply identify. We are going to learn to identify f of x and g of x. And we do this by looking at our function, and f of x is whatever is on the numerator, and g of x is whatever is on the denominator, as you can see here. So I'm just going to leave this as a side note. F of x is numerator. G of x is whatever function you have on the denominator. And then the next step, once you have f of x and g of x, which right now we're going to identify f of x as our function on the numerator, so it would be 4x cubed minus 3x squared. And our g of x is our function on the denominator, which would be 4x to the 5th minus 4. Once we have that, we need to find, looking at this quotient rule formula, we see that we need f prime of x and g prime of x. So we find f prime of x as well as g prime of x by taking the derivative. So the derivative of this function of f of x is we take the derivative of each term, since there's a minus sign. So the derivative of 4x cubed would be 12x squared. And the derivative of 3x cubed would be 6x. So minus 6x. Don't forget this minus sign. And the derivative of g of x to get g prime of x would be 20x to the 4th. And the derivative of minus 4 is 0, so we're not going to include it in g prime of x. So after we identify f of x and g of x, the next step would be to identify f prime of x and g prime of x. In doing so, we get these terms, f prime of x and g prime of x. So then the next step, once we have f of x and g of x, f prime of x and g prime of x, the next step would be to plug it all into the quotient rule. So the quotient rule up here, I'm going to rewrite it down here. So we're going to plug into quotient rule. And yeah, the quotient rule, it's a lot of plugging in. So once you get used to calculus, what I would actually just recommend, high key, would be to try to avoid using quotient rule. Use the chain rule or product rule. But if you have to use a quotient rule, well, you have to know how to apply it. So we're going to, in this case, we have to use the quotient rule, so we're going to use it. So we're going to plug in g of x times f prime of x minus g prime of x times f of x. And we're going to divide this all over g of x squared. And this is equal to the derivative of f of x over g of x. So now it's just a matter of plugging in. So what's g of x? 5x to the 5th minus 4. F prime of x is 12x squared minus 6x minus g prime of x is 20x to the 4th power times f of x. F of x would be right here. So f of x is 4x cubed minus 3x squared. All over gx squared. So gx squared is 4x to the 5th minus 4 squared. And this is how we apply the quotient rule. And yeah, if you want to, if you have to, if your professor asks you to distribute, then yeah, FOIL out the terms right here, distribute this term into here and here, FOIL this out. And I'm not going to do it because I taught the concept. I'm not going to teach how to distribute. And in more cases than not, most professors are okay with you just leaving it like this. So you don't have to actually FOIL this term out. You can leave it as gx squared. But if you have to, then yeah, just apply algebra to distribute. But otherwise, that's how you perform the quotient rule. Thank you for watching. I hope it was helpful.